So just to make everybody aware, and that's so that we can upload this recording onto our intranet page afterwards, and so everybody can get access to it. And the main thing I just wanted to say is we really appreciate you taking a couple of hours out of your really busy days. We know it's quite hard to get away from the operational practices to take part in events like today, but we hope you're really going to enjoy it. And I'm going to be joined by 4 fantastic colleagues from across Europe, who I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves in a bit more detail as it's their turn to speak. So how this 2-hour workshop will work, and I will try and keep it to time as best I can so we can let you get on with your day afterwards. But I'm going to give you a brief introduction to Europris and CEP and the work of those organisations along with the expert group. I'm then going to hand over to my colleagues who are each going to offer a presentation on practices from their respective countries, which will last about 20 minutes. So we really would welcome questions as we go through, but what I'm going to ask, just again because of how many people we've got online, is that you put those in the chat, and I will kind of try and keep a mind of where they're going, and after each presentation we're going to allow about 5 minutes for questions, so we'll try and group and theme those questions as best we can. I just wanted to say right from the outset, obviously we are talking about domestic abuse and kind of domestic abuse practices across Europe. We appreciate that can be a sensitive topic, and given the high prevalence rates, we know that it's quite likely that some of you on the call may have experienced abuse yourself, or may well know people personally that have experienced abuse. So please, if you need to take time for yourself at any point through this and you need to drop out of the call for a few minutes, feel free to do that. And likewise, feel free, make sure you're using all those support networks that are available to you after the call should you require. So just before we go into the main events and the main presentations, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Confederation of European Probation and Europris first of all. So these organisations operate very separately, but both I suppose have got the same aim and the same intention, which is really to try and improve communication and cooperation between different European member states. And it's really with the view of trying to exchange information, knowledge, best practice to enhance practices around Europe, and with the ultimate aim of reducing reoffending and of course enhancing public safety. Now, one thing I'd really like you to bear in mind as we go through some of the presentations today is obviously within England and Wales, we operate prison and probation under one umbrella. Although we've got 2 slightly different services working together, we're still under that same umbrella with lots of really positive information sharing agreements in place. So for many of our European counterparts, prison and probation operate quite separately, to the extent where sometimes that information sharing isn't there. Sometimes there's even laws in place to prohibit that information sharing between prison and probation services, which I know for myself I was quite shocked by, but I just want you to bear that in mind as we're going through some of the presentations. I should also say that, like with any organisation and practice, Europe and each of our respective countries use lots of different language and terminology to what we do ourselves. So if there's anything that you hear and you're not quite sure on, throw that into the chat, and either myself, I'll give it a go at trying to answer what that means, or my colleagues on the line will help to explain that in a little bit more detail. But going back to Europris and CEP then, so Europris, I believe, has got around 33 member countries, and England and Wales are part of that. The Confederation of European Probation, I think, has got about 37, and that's made up both of probation services and different academic organisations that filter into that. So obviously that's who they are and what they aim to do, but what actually do these organisations do on the ground? Well, one of the big things they do is offer expert advice in relation to practice and policy. So if a country is trying to, say, set up a new initiative, or they've got a new legislation coming in and want to kind of get some advice from other people about how to manage that, they might go to Europris or CEP to get some advice along those lines. And likewise, both organisations have some function where they're able to undertake project work. They also both really try to communicate and share good practice, and they do that through a number of different strategies and newsletters. They set up different European workshops and webinars and that kind of thing. And they've also both set up different expert groups on various topics. And generally speaking, they operate quite separately. So Europris have set up, and you may be aware of these already, but expert groups on things like working with foreign national prisoners, on radicalisation, even on ICT, so technologies in prison. CEP have done very much the same, so they've set up expert groups on violent extremism and sexual offending and topics such as mental health, and sharing best practice in that sense. And I suppose this is really how the expert group on domestic violence came about. So I think the idea arose in about 2018, and the group was officially formed in 2019. And each of the member countries, so there's actually 12 core countries represented in the expert group, were asked to nominate someone to represent their country. And it was this joint group was really set up with the intention, oh sorry, I'm just admitting people as I'm talking, and the expert group was really set up with the intention of promoting better awareness of domestic abuse, of improving the national regulation of domestic abuse, and also sharing best practice in regard to countering domestic violence. So obviously England and Wales is represented within that. We've also got colleagues today from Ireland, Northern Ireland, the Czech Republic and Belgium. So you're going to hear from some of those representatives today. But outside of that, we've also got representatives, and I'm going to have to read this from the list because else I forget. Finland, Slovakia, Slovenia, Sweden, Catalonia and Lithuania. So we've got quite a broad spectrum of people involved, and that's a really good mix of different practices and different legislations even. So what have we done over the last few years since this group was set up? Well, we try and meet face to face on at least a yearly basis. And during that, oh, can I ask you to go on mute? We try and meet up on a yearly basis, and the agenda has really varied. So we've focused on all sorts of things through domestic violence risk assessments, risk management strategies, interventions. We've focused on different kind of evaluation strategies. We've been really fortunate to have some really specialist presenters come in to present to us and to go and visit certain places as well. And if anybody is interested, if you go on either the Europris or CEP websites, there are notes from all of these meetings with the agenda items and many of the presentations, so you're able to access that information. Likewise, for those of you that might be interested in interventions and programmes with perpetrators of domestic abuse, quite in the early days, we collated quite a wealth of information about the different programmes that run in the different countries, in terms of what the programmes are, what the assessment processes are, what their theoretical underpinnings are, and what logistically they look like in terms of number of sessions, the length, what they cover. So feel free to go on and have a look at some of that information if it appeals to you. We've been involved in developing a special edition domestic violence newsletter, which has gone out via the CEP and Europris communication routes. Again, this is all accessible on the websites. And we were really fortunate, I think, last year, especially given COVID, to host a 2-day conference for European people to attend. And actually, so you're going to hear some of those presentations tweaked, I think, today. But so that would be great. Oh, I can put the URL into the chat in a while, but it's basically, if you just Google Europris or the Confederation of European Probation, you'll find the website, so they're easy enough to access. And that conference, just going back, was focused on a whole host of things relating to domestic abuse, from the evidence base through some of the presentations today. We had a great opportunity to trial virtual reality in treatment programmes, which was exceptionally interesting. There was discussion of restorative justice. And so again, a lot of the presentations from that conference are all available to you on those websites. So that was, I hope, a brief introduction to the work of the expert group in CEP and Europris. And if you've not heard of those before, I do encourage you to go and have a look on the websites, because they have got some really useful resources. But for the main event, I'm going to hand over to some of our speakers today. So we're going to first hear from Sabrina, then Geraldine, then Carmel, and then Vaclav. So first of all, I'm going to hand over to Sabrina, who I believe is going to share her own slides. Now, Sabrina is the coordinator at the Family Justice Centre in Limburg in Belgium. And Sabrina's going to, we recognise, first of all, we've got a wealth of experience on this call, but Sabrina's going to set the scene and just remind us all of why it's so important to focus on domestic abuse and violence, and then talk to us about the multi-agency approach they take in Limburg. So I'm going to hand over to you, Sabrina.
Hi, good day. As 11 o'clock is always good morning, hello, so good day. Let me just click that away. Thank you for having me. Welcome to everyone. It's nice to see a couple of already familiar faces and very nice to see some new faces. And like Sarah said, it's also very nice to be talking to people and not blank bullets on my screen. So my name is Sabrina. I'm the coordinator from the Family Justice Center in Limburg. But before I get into what is a Family Justice Center and how do we work, we discussed it and we would like to start by introducing the topic of domestic violence very briefly, because I heard that there's a very broad audience and I don't know what you already know about domestic violence and what you don't. So if you already know this, see it as some sort of refreshment of your memory. And for the ones who don't know it, well, welcome to domestic violence. I'm going to share my screen with the computer sounds. And normally you should see my screen. Can someone confirm, please?
Yeah, we just need to put it onto slideshow, Sabrina.
Yeah, I'm not going to put it onto slideshow because then I'm not sure if my link is going to work. So I'm just going to, but I'm going to minimize you so that you don't have to look at yourself the whole time. So I'm just going to do the slides for now. Actually, my topic, or the reason why I'm here, is to talk about the added value of multi-agency approaches in domestic violence cases. But before that, I want to give you a short introduction to domestic violence. Domestic violence has a very high dark number. We know from scientific research that only a very limited percentage seeks out help or goes to the police after a violent incident. We also know that about 1 in 4 in the population will ever be affected by it. And what's also shocking, that it takes about 35 numbers of violent incidents on average before someone seeks out help, which indicates it takes a lot of violent incidents before you go out and say, help me, please. So that's why it's so important when someone reaches out for help, that they're taken seriously, that they that they feel like they're heard, that they are believed, because it took a lot of courage to take that step towards help. It also takes about 7 numbers of attempts on average before someone really leaves a violent relationship. This is also one of the reasons why domestic violence sometimes is experienced as frustrating. For instance, by police officers that I talk to, they say, well, why do we have to keep intervening? Because we intervene and then they say it's over, we're going our separate ways, and then a week later we see them again walking happily in love down the streets. But that's because there's this specific dynamics on domestic violence. It's a dangerous vicious circle which is very difficult to break. You have the cycle of violence. I'm not going into that because that would be way too theoretical for this presentation. But note that there's the cycle of violence, which is often in combination with multiple underlying problems. Substance abuse, for instance, financial problems, personality disorders, problem with the children, and which is also very important, is that you bear in mind that there are different dynamics or offender profiles, and depending on which offender profile, there are consequences for treatment. You have to treat a case of domestic violence, which is called the intimate terrorism cases, which are the black and white cases where you have one offender which uses his power and dominance over a victim. You have to treat those on a very different manner than, for instance, of a couple where you have a lot of stress underlying problems, but it's not the power dynamics that are at the forefront, but more the dynamics between them. You have to approach them very differently. And now I'm going to share with you a fragment. I have to, perhaps someone already knows it. It's a fragment, it's a genuine 911 call of a 5-6-year-old who witnesses domestic violence and he calls the police. I have to warn you, sometimes people can react emotionally to the video because you really hear the emotions of the child. Let's hope it works. And with the audio.
Standing emergency.
My mommy and Daddy are having a fight.
Is she getting hurt?
I'm talking to the police, Mommy. Daddy! The baby! Did you get to the police, please?
Okay, we're going to be there. What's going on?
They're having a fight because this has been going on forever and ever.
How's he hurting her?
He made some red marks on Mommy.
Where did he make the red marks on?
Her neck. Oh my God!
What's the matter? Is your mother... Hello?
Domestic violence could have a very strong impact on children. I brought one study with me, and that's the ACE study. It's the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which by Dr. Fidelity. It's a study from the United States, and they asked 17,000 people if they encountered one of those experiences during growing up. So physical, emotional, sexual abuse, physical, emotional neglect, or were there household dysfunctions such as mental illness, a relative that was incarcerated, whether there was substance abuse, whether there was domestic violence between the parents, or whether there was something as common as a divorce. And if you look at the numbers, so they looked at children, and about 33% grew up in a house where there were no ACEs, so no adverse childhood experiences. 51 had 1, 2, 3 of those experiences, and 16% had over 4 of those. And if you look at the statistics, if you look at these numbers, they're mind-blowing and not in a good way. If you look at the chances of becoming, for instance, addicted to alcohol, a child that grew up in one of those houses without those ACEs has a 1 in 96%, 1 in 96 has the chance of becoming alcoholic. And if you grow up in household with 7 or more of those ACEs, it becomes 1 in 6. And I would like to ask you now, from all the families that you see, I think everyone here can imagine one of those families who has a lot of those ACEs where those children grow up in. And it's not to say that those children are doomed. or anything, but it's just, it's way harder during out life. They have a lot more that they have in their, well, in Flemish we say in their backpack. I don't know if it's also an expression in English, but just to show how much domestic violence impacts children. It's also, it requires a specific approach to domestic violence. Like I already said, it's common and highly underreported. Also complex and dangerous dynamics. Specifically for domestic violence, those who are involved, they often stay involved in each other's environment. I always use the example when there's when you get robbed on the streets and you also get hit. That also hurts and can be traumatic, but you will probably only see the offender during mediation or in court, but afterwards you won't see that person again. With domestic violence, the one that hurts you often stays in your life. You can quit being partners, but you can't quit being mother and father to the same children, or you stay mother and son, for instance. So the involvement often stays in one way or another. And like I already said, it has a devastating impact on children, which includes the intergenerational transfer. It also has a great social cost. When we look at a lower quality of life, the high governmental costs, for instance, in our region, it's the when I talk to the police, domestic violence is the most common intervention for them. Also for the Justice Department, it's one of the highest cases come from domestic violence. You also have higher work absenteeism, lower productivity, health problems, mental health problems, and often there are many services involved which transcend policy domains, levels, and competencies. And I always bring this picture along. You have a child in the middle, but it symbolizes a family, and all the colorful dots are agencies, organizations that could be involved. The blue ones are everything from police, justice, the prosecutor, a judge, the probation commission, the houses of justice, the youth court, prison. The pink ones are administration center, city services, and the social welfare, the administrational part. The purple ones are everything that has to do with medical agencies, the doctor, the clinics, drug addiction centers, mental health facilities. And then you have all the yellow ones, which are welfare agencies. This, let's call it gold, is the educational organizations, and in green is everything that is involved in housing, shelters, and so on. If you look at this picture, that are a lot of dots, and a lot of dots have to start working together if we all want to help the family. And that's where the Family Justice Center here in Limburg comes into picture. We are a multidisciplinary approach to domestic violence. Family Justice Center, the idea behind it comes from the United States. And we made it a little bit more Flemish, a little bit more Limburg, so for our region. And what are we? We are not an organization on our own, but actually we are a corporation, a multidisciplinary team of professionals and a lot of different services, organizations that work together under one roof. We all have the same goal, so to tackle domestic violence on a coordinated, systemic, if possible, approach. And we also have clients who can visit, not yet directly, after referrals at the moment, but we're looking into ways how we can open our doors one way or another. I don't know what the future will bring. Now, which services are already working together with us? The logos won't say anything for you, but it's the police departments, the houses of justice, general welfare, the agencies for youth services are involved, mental health care is involved, the addiction services, the federal police is involved, and also the public prosecutor, who is one of our biggest supporters. Also the local municipalities and their, in Flemish it's called OCMW's, it's the social part of the municipalities, are all involved. Now, the main idea is take the best of what you already have and bring it all together. So how do we work? When there's in our region, and we work for about a region of 330,000 inhabitants, when there's a violent incident and a domestic violence case, the police will intervene and they will draw up their police report. In every of the police departments that work with us, there are people who are trained to draw up a family file. So very important, we work with family files and not case by or intervention by intervention or client by client, but into a family file. They will list up what happened, why did police intervene, what do we know about risk factors, protective factors, and they will do a risk screening. And a risk assessment, they will try to categorize the family into low, medium, or high risk case family, which are the green, orange, and red colors. They will indicate their opinion about the family. They will send the case over to the public prosecutor's office. They will also look at the file, see what they know about the family, about the children, and they will put it in the family file and see whether the green, orange, or red can be maintained or that there has to be a change in risk assessment. Unfortunately, at the beginning, we had to choose because we have a limited capacity to give guidance to clients, to give them an offer, to give them, and our organizations decided that even though we know that choosing is losing, that we are going to start by focusing on the medium to high risk families. So in the low risk families, the public prosecutor's office will send them a letter with a brochure stating, we know about the police intervention, it's not okay, please seek out help, and in this brochure you can find help. The multi-agency approach really comes into perspective when we talk about those medium and high risk families. We will share information with all the partners that I listed up before. So between the police department, the justice department, the social welfare, the houses of justice, which include the probation services, youth services. And we are very happy because about 2 years ago, we had a change in legislation which enables us to share information without getting into trouble with our professional secrecy. So we have the permission of the public prosecutor's office to share that information. It's very limited information. Do you know those clients? Is it an active or a finished trajectory that you have with them? And is there information that you want to share with the other partners? Depending on all the information that we gather, we will do an assessment of an added value. Do we have an added value for those clients to reach out to them and ask them if they want to have a trajectory with us, whether they want to come to our locations to talk about the violence, to talk about safety, to talk about the stress factors and how that affects their day-to-day life and how we can seek out help and to give them help. So we look at every case, every family, every time. We monitor who's already involved, is someone involved or not, how can we have that added value, and we can do the offer, so start up a trajectory. We also have a specific approach for honor-related crimes, which are only about 1% of our caseload, but they are so extremely high risk and there isn't that much experience yet in Belgium about honor-related crimes. So we're happy that we have that we got some money from one of our ministries to develop a specific approach for those crimes. Now, what is the added value of working together with all those agencies, working together with the public prosecutor's office, with the police department, with social welfare, with the probation services? We can coordinate it. We can share information with each other thanks to the legislation that we have. Also, that there's a structural risk assessment going on, and that we have an overview file of every family, that we can have a tailor-made approach for every family, and that we have a team of domestic violence experts here who only work with domestic violence, that we can have a swift approach, and also that we work under the same roof. So in my reality, across from my office, there are 2 people working from the police department and next to them are people from the public prosecutor's office. Next to them, there are caseworkers who work with the families, and it increases the knowledge of each other's organizations. Also, the trust between organizations grows exponentially by working together in this manner, and also that we can have a proactive approach to our clients who suffered domestic violence. Now, this was in, I hope I stayed within my time because I didn't. Oh, now, can someone please stop sharing my screen? Because, there it is. Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sabrina, for a really insightful presentation about not just the kind of multi-agency working, but also the Family Justice Centre in Limburg and where you are. And I think for people on the call, it'll be really interesting to think about that process and how that compares certainly to England and Wales. So I'm just wondering if anybody's got any additional questions they'd like to add into the chat. There's one in there already, but those questions can of course be about anything Sabrina's spoken about, or maybe anything you'd like to know about Belgian practices as well. The first question, Sabrina, it came in really early doors, and I think it was because that video clip that you played of the child calling the police, it's quite harrowing actually, isn't it? So, and I think Nicola's asked, do you know the outcome of that call at all?
Yeah, because it's a video that's in America. It's an older video, but it was shared a lot of in talk shows, and I recall that the outcome was that the police went over there, and I think the offender was arrested afterwards. But it's limited, the information that was shared about the outcome of that call, but it got obviously police intervention and so on and so on. Then I also see, because I opened up the chat, the structured risk assessment tool. At the moment, we use our a risk assessment, which is based on a couple of other risk assessment tools. So we're in the process of looking at a way to get it clinically, scientifically evaluated. And is there a mock example of a family file to read through? I'll send it to Sarah, and then you can put it also online, because it was one of the deliverables that we had to deliver for a European project, so it's available in English. So I'll send it to you.
Yeah, if it comes through to me, and I can make sure that's disseminated to everybody on this call today, and we'll see what we can upload to the internet. Yeah, so I think you've got another question, Sabrina, from Sarah. So what kind of processes are in place to continue with the multi-agency working when an individual is sent to custody?
At the moment, we're also looking into a cooperation with the prison, and but for us, if one of our sent into custody, so went into prison, one of our caseworkers can keep if the offender wants to have a trajectory with us, we look at the cooperation with the prison, whether we give the guidance, I don't know if it's the right word in English, to the client, or whether it's the prison services. But then we ask the prison if they can alert us when the offender goes free, so that we can maintain our trajectory there. But like I said, in the next couple of months, we're looking into a very more intensive cooperation with the prison services. And the improvements for families. Also, yeah, sometimes words in English, they trip my tongue. I can't give you a scientific evaluation yet. We had done some qualitative studies. So we asked clients that already went through the whole trajectory, and they were very satisfied to very satisfied. We're looking at we're looking for funding at the moment to have recidivism study done in the future. So at the moment, I can't give it to you on black and white or in writing, but we notice on a day-to-day basis that we can change people's life, and that we have an effect for families. And especially because we have such strong corporations, we can give them more information, or for instance, about the traditional trajectory, which also helps clients. And how this does compare to England and Wales approach, I think that would be a great question at the end, after our colleagues also give their presentations. And I would also like to refer you all to the European Family Justice Center Alliance. They have an overview of the family justice centers throughout Europe, because every family justice center at the moment has their own approach and the way they work, and they have an overview there. So I would like to refer you all to that site. I will also put it into one of my slides, Sarah, and then everyone has that website also.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Sabrina. And that pulls us perfectly onto timing. So and I think that question to hold in mind, some of the comparisons to maybe England and Wales towards the end, if we've got time to reflect on that, that would be fantastic. So thank you again for joining us this morning, Sabrina, and I believe you're staying with us for a little while yet as well, which is great. So I'm now going to hand over to Geraldine O'Hare. So Geraldine is the Director of Rehabilitation for the Probation Board in Northern Ireland, and Geraldine's going to speak to us this morning about early intervention work to prevent offending. So do you want, I will share the slides, Geraldine, so shout if they don't come up.
Will do. Okay. Thanks, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see you all. I see some familiar faces and some familiar names, which is lovely. So I think if we just go back to the start, Sarah, I think we're halfway through that.
1 minute.
Yep.
Let me just find. Ah, yes, we are.
Got it.
Is that better?
Super. Fabulous, thank you. So good morning, everyone. As Sarah said, I'm Geraldine O'Hare, and I'm our Director of Rehabilitation for the Probation Board here in Northern Ireland. So it's a great privilege to be here today, and I want to thank Sarah for pulling all of this together. So Sarah's our chair for the expert working group on domestic abuse, and I have to say she has led the group superbly, and it's been a wonderful experience to be able to contribute to that group with all of our colleagues across Europe. So thank you very much for that, Sarah. It's very interesting, actually. I really enjoyed Sabrina's presentation because I think it leads very neatly and seamlessly, I suppose, into what I'm going to talk about today, which is how do we provide early interventions to alleged perpetrators of domestic abuse. And it's really important that we have that conversation around how we can intervene early, because as I always say, having worked here in the Probation Board for many years, first of all as a forensic psychologist and now as the Director of Rehabilitation, that we absolutely must get upstream if we are to tackle domestic abuse. So if we move on to the next slide, very briefly, and I am so mindful of time because I could run over, and I know I'm not allowed to out of respect for my own colleagues and everybody here today. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about how we have introduced a problem-solving justice strategy. And the problem-solving justice strategy obviously includes how we work upstream with alleged perpetrators of domestic abuse. So Sabrina has spoken so well about the whole statistics and the data around domestic abuse, which I'm not going to repeat. But through the problem-solving approach that we have taken here in Northern Ireland, we ask ourselves, can this apply to domestic abuse? And if so, how do we do this? Why would we invest in treatment, intervention, whatever terminology that you want to use around with perpetrators? How do the problem-solving justice initiatives work? Do they work with perpetrators of domestic abuse? Are they effective? And what are the benefits for criminal justice and indeed beyond? So Sarah, if we move on just in terms of what does that look like here in Northern Ireland? And I have to give a plug to my colleagues that are doing another workshop on Thursday, and they're going to look more specifically around the around the Northern Ireland context. So I do urge you to attend that, and that will look at domestic abuse from within a public protection context. But I'm specifically just going to talk about today our early intervention work. So within Northern Ireland, we have had many strategies to look at domestic abuse, many government strategies to look at early interventions. And within those strategies, we've always had a stream or a work stream around, well, you know, how do we work earlier, more effectively, and more upstream with those who potentially have the propensity to commit domestic abuse acts and behaviour. And what we want to do is actually divert them from the justice system, because as we all know, once they reach court, prison, probation, etc., the harm has been done, the domestic abuse has been perpetrated. We've seen some from Sabrina's slideshow, the impact clearly on that young child. So what we want to do is actually get upstream and not have these people come into the system. In other words, divert them. And that really for us is about problem solving domestic abuse. We know that there's lots of benefits, and we know in order to reduce the number of victims coming through into our society and the impact on the community, that we need to get to those upstream initiatives. And I suppose, in fairness, we often ask ourselves, is that our space to be? Because within justice and clearly within probation, we all have an understanding of what probation and justice actually do and around our core work in terms of working with offenders. And I've often asked myself that question, getting upstream, stepping outside of the justice system to work with alleged perpetrators, is that our space to be? I always come back to the same response, which is yes. If it's about doing the right thing, preventing domestic abuse, then absolutely we're in the right space. So Sarah, if we move on to the next slide, I'm not going to talk very much about this, but it's just to set the context in terms of we have a 5-year problem-solving strategy that we have developed in Northern Ireland, within the Department of Justice have developed this. And within that strategy and that portfolio are a number of projects that we align and I suppose have placed on the problem-solving justice portfolio. And I'm not going to go into any detail in any of them other than to say the domestic violence perpetrator programme is there, which is what I'm going to speak to you about today. And you'll see, and obviously our outcome 7 of our then programme for government encouraged us to look at how we develop a safe community respecting the law and others. And clearly all of those indicators that we all have responsibility for here in Northern Ireland in terms of reaching is to reduce reoffending, and obviously from our perspective talking about domestic abuse, reduce domestic abuse perpetrators and actually reduce that even happening. So what is problem solving? And I'm not again going to go into any detail, but the high level, I suppose, messages from problem solving justice is that it addresses the root causes of the problem. So exactly what Sabrina has spoken about, you know, actually how do we get to the root causes of the domestic abuse? Sabrina talked about the ACEs. What we really need to do is avoid that transgenerational cycle of domestic abuse, which we see in all of those ACEs and all of those people that come into the justice system with so many ACEs that we can track back. That's where we need to actually touch, which is upstream, identifying what the causes are and actually addressing them. Problem solving justice looks at those innovative, creative early interventions, which is what I believe that we're introducing here in Northern Ireland. And the problem solving justice initiatives and courts, which we have here in Northern Ireland, allows an alternative to an imprisonment or other sentences. In other words, they are specialist treatment courts, which are often referred to. And again, I don't have time to go into the detail of that, but very happy to share that information and that research with others. And it's really about treating the individual and providing interventions to those individuals who present with that risk. And one of the things that it does, which again sits very nicely with the previous presentation, is it joins up a lot of those key agencies, because clearly, particularly around domestic abuse, not one single agency can tackle domestic abuse on their own, or shouldn't. So in terms of why would we actually invest in interventions, Sarah, if you just move on, thank you, through the slides. As I say, it treats the root causes of the problem. It provides more appropriate options for sentencers, or indeed for others that are tasked with managing people who do perpetrate or alleged perpetrators of domestic abuse. It reduces prison populations because they're clearly not coming into the system. It reduces recidivism, reoffending, and offending because they're not coming into the system. And most importantly, it reduces the number of victims in our society. And it is cost effective, and I'll come back and talk about that just in a moment. This is where we may run into problems, Sarah. The next slide is a little, very one minute animation of what we've developed here in Northern Ireland, and we're going to try and see if it works, but off you go. I don't think we've got sound, do we? Okay. Unless you can find the sound, I think we'll just skip it.
Yeah,
okay, don't worry. Basically, all that animation is just a description that we've developed here in Northern Ireland about the journey of problem-solving justice and the interventions that it sets out. So what do early intervention domestic abuse programs here in Northern Ireland look like? So we've talked about the evidence base. Sarah, if you just click the next slide, we've talked about the evidence base for problem-solving justice, and this is where we, I suppose, position domestic abuse in terms of all of the evidence that we know that a problem-solving justice approach applies to. And there's a huge amount of research for anybody that's interested in terms of drug courts and substance misuse courts, and they really led the charge way back in the 80s. And again, we are looking across to the United States for that evidence, but what we're trying to build up here is what that evidence would look like, hence the introduction of the problem-solving justice strategy, which is where we have a whole range of things such as substance misuse, mental health, and domestic abuse. And one of the things that we've always taken from the research is that by applying these early intervention problem-solving approaches, in terms of effectiveness and cost effectiveness, it is paid back by reduced costs of imprisonment, further offences, and most important is the reduction of victims in our society. So Sarah, next slide is looking at these programs. What do we know about domestic abuse programs? I'm not going to teach all of you on here what it is, because I have a fair idea that a lot of you know the research around domestic abuse programs, but we do know that they're not a soft option. And what we have done over the years is develop that strengths-based approach to domestic abuse programs. And many of you here will know, and no doubt have been involved in possibly the design or the delivery of some of these programs. For us, we have started way back 25 years ago in developing a program now, which I refer, well, it was called MODV, and that was Men Overcoming Domestic Violence. Looking back on that now, and I was involved in that, in the design of that program, I don't like that term. And then we obviously moved along and we worked obviously with HMPPS, and we adopted the IDAP program, and then obviously BBR, the Building Better Relationships program, as it is now. So we run the BBR. We have always gone with the HMPPS programs. However, with us, I suppose, stepping upstream, what we needed to do was to look at other interventions in order to address the potential need of those people that were not within the justice system. And I know somebody's going to ask me, well, who are those people? Those people we identified whenever we were working on the domestic sexual violence strategy many years ago, probably about 7, 8, maybe 10 years ago, and working alongside our health colleagues, etc., that we all identified, well, what about the people that appear, for example, as a result of their children being on the child protection register, where there is alleged abuse, where there is alleged harm, where there's alleged risk and need? These are the people that ultimately we find coming into the justice system, and we deliver these programs to. So what about getting into a space with our colleagues in health, and actually delivering an intervention to those men, and they are men that we've delivered these to those men whose children are on the child protection register, where there is alleged domestic abuse. So that was our target group. And in order to do that, what we needed, well, clearly the existing programs were not going to meet that need because they were for adjudicated offenders. So what we set about doing is actually writing our own programs, and the PPRP, and we're full of acronyms here, so apologies for that, but it stands for Promoting Positive Relationships Programme, and the RRI stands for the Respectful Relationships Programme. So we decided that we, alongside the Department of Health and our health trusts here, that we would design a programme, and I'm going to talk to you very briefly about that programme today, that would actually target those men whose children were on the child protection register, who clearly we could intervene early with, and hopefully avoid those people coming into the justice system. In other words, inputting and providing interventions that could assist social services to A, work with the individual, work with the family, and B, stop that person committing any further abuse if that was the case. We didn't do it on our own, we most certainly didn't, and we worked in partnership, and we set about delivering or writing these programs and developing that integrated approach. And I have to say, we learned huge amounts from the existing programs from HMPPS, because that's very much what we have been delivering over many of those years. So a little bit about the program, Sarah, if we move on. So what is the PPRP, Promoting Positive Relationships Programme? We developed it, as I say, we have 5 health trusts. We have 1 Department of Health here in Northern Ireland, and we have 5 regional health trusts all around the province. So we set about, we developed our own domestic abuse team. We worked alongside social services, and we worked with Women's Aid. So they are the critical, I suppose, partners that formed that team. And we wrote the programme. I'm going to share a slide with you, just the main, I suppose, modules of that programme. We wrote the programme, and we spent a very long time debating the suitability criteria, how the referral from social services may be made, etc. And basically, we then designed the programme, and we then, as probation, determined the programme needs using the Be Safer, which a lot of you will be familiar with. One of the aspects that we built into that programme was the current or former partner of the programme would be offered support from our partner support worker. So in other words, if the individual who was offered the programme from social services, delivered by probation, if they did not want their current or former partner to be involved, they didn't get a place in the programme. So it was, they didn't have a choice. Either they wanted to work with us, and that included their partner, or they didn't. And we set about having weekly information sharing meetings with social services. We pulled a lot of the practitioners together. Women's Aid were a key partner in all of this. And then obviously at the end of that programme, the report is finally produced, and obviously there's an evaluation. Now that all sounds very easy. Believe me, it wasn't easy. We spent probably about 2 years designing this, and what the process would look like and how the referrals would come. We went into social services, we went into the health trusts, and we trained all of their social workers that were working in child protection, to look at identifying domestic abuse, to be able to identify that risk. And we did an awful lot of work with social services and in order to build up that awareness and that expertise. Okay, Sarah, if we just move on. So basically, very briefly, the chronology of this and how that looks. So basically, the referral is made to the programme from social services. Probation team do the assessment. The current or former partners offered support from Women's Aid. That's not negotiable. That must happen. Once then all of that happens and the individual is deemed appropriate, they join the programme. There are so many reviews all the way through this. So the probation officer has that direct link with that referring social worker. And that's where that multi-agency partnership begins. The information is shared, and the social worker is able to work with the family in terms of doing a child protection plan and a safety plan. The Women's Aid worker is working with the victim or the partner, and it is a multi-agency approach to this programme. Obviously, then the end of programme report, and we do the evaluation. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about that. Sarah, I'm not going to do the next slide because we don't have time to do it, but basically the criteria, and I know that's something that you may be interested in if you just jump to the slides. Sarah, Perfect. What is the suitability criteria? We spent a long time deciding what that might be. We then broke it down to, let's not complicate this, let's make it easy and straightforward. They had to be over 18. They had to acknowledge that there was a level of domestic abuse within an intimate partner relationship, and they were willing to attend the programme. It was as simple as that. And they obviously had a command of the English language, and they were prepared to sign the contract, and which would allow the safety planning of work to be done with Women's Aid and with the Trust. Now, if you had been involved in the discussions that we had, it was very highfalutin in terms of all the criteria. We decided just to scrape away at it, because the bottom line is, excuse me, what we wanted these men to get involved in the programme. And sometimes people would say, oh, you know, they only want to do the programme to have access to their child. And I'd say, that's okay, because actually that's a sign of their motivation. Let's get them on the programme, and we will work with them on all other aspects of it. So the beginning of that programme, of that journey, I suppose, was very interesting for us in terms of the types of people that were referred to the programme, the types of people that weren't suitable, how we weeded through them. And we ran one programme in one of the trusts that was a huge success. We could have ran it 10 times over. We used to have people phoning us saying, you know, I've heard about this programme, can we pay to come on it? And I thought, well, as nice as that sounds, no. You know, we've got a route and we've got an appropriate referral pathway that you must come through. So Sarah, just very briefly, if we move on. And then, so I remember talking to people and partners and stakeholders about this programme. And we thought, okay, so that's one aspect that we can deliver in terms of those individuals with potentially high need and high risk, that they are diverted into the PPRP. What about those individuals who don't necessarily will meet that threshold? What do we do with them? And obviously we all know the issues around, you know, the risk need responsivity, ensuring that people are appropriately placed in terms of the right programme, the right dose, etc. So we set about then developing another programme, which I'm not going to talk to you about today, which is for those that are not suitable for the group work PPRP, and that was the Respectful Relationships Programme intervention. And that was very much a toolkit. So we developed a toolkit, and we introduced that then to all probation officers that could use that as part of their supervision. So in other words, when they're supervising somebody on an offence which is not related to domestic abuse, but some aspects of that behaviour appear, they then can use the aspects and modules of the RRI in terms of their supervision, and that's been really, really effective. Again, I'm not going to go into many detail, but there lies the options. And the next slide, Sarah, then very briefly provides an overview of what that RRI looks like and the sessions, what that focuses on. It allows individual probation officer to be able to select aspects, modules of the programme, and they can do that as part of their supervision. So without getting into the detail, that's the types of modules that we deliver as part of that RRI. In terms of the next slide, the Promoting Positive Relationships programme, this is the one that has, I suppose, if you ask me, it is our most early intervention, upstream problem-solving programme that we have, because these men are not in justice, and actually we don't ever want them in justice. And I remember somebody saying in a meeting, well, we get them before they come into justice, and I'm saying absolutely not. Change that narrative. We get them, we don't want them in justice, so it's not before they come into justice. If they come into justice, then something hasn't gone right. So it is about diverting them and making sure that they never come into justice. So the programme is 24 weeks of sessions, 2 hours per week, and we've got 5 core modules to this. And again, working right across all of the agencies. And very recently, we just got our accreditation for the programme in December 2021 from Respect. So really keen, and that, you know, I'm really delighted that the team achieved that, because it does give that credibility, I suppose, to what we've done in the research that we've conducted. I'm nearly finished because I know I'm probably running out of time, Sarah. And again, you know, Sabrina spoke about this. Let's not do it in a silo approach. Let's all work together. Everybody has something to contribute when we talk about tackling domestic abuse. So it is part of that multi-agency response to domestic abuse here. We have now developed the programme right across Northern Ireland. So instead of one health trust, all of the health trusts have now bought into this. So in effect, I suppose we have a domestic abuse option within the health trust areas, and which probably would never have been the case in the past, and health have really embraced this, which has been fabulous, because it also gives them those interventions to offer to people who have their children on the child protection register where there is alleged abuse, domestic abuse. I can't speak high enough of all of our partners and our own team who have been absolutely wonderful, and our partner support workers and all of our probation officers and psychologists and probation service officers, and they've all been fabulous. I'm so pleased for them that they did get their accreditation. Just very briefly then, Sarah, if we move on to the programme modules, and again, you know, these are the high level programme modules, and obviously each of them are broken down into weekly sessions that are delivered. And as you can imagine, you know, they are looking at behaviour and communication, an introduction obviously to the programme, looking at managing emotions, looking at parenting, because what we've often found, and I know people here will agree with this, is that when we work with perpetrators of domestic abuse, one of the things that we've often found through our work is that they really do struggle with being a poor parent, or bad parent isn't the right word, but that's often where we get a light bulb moment, and we spend a lot of time looking at responsible parenting and then planning for the future. So that's the modules very briefly, and the skills that we cover, Sarah, in the next slide. The typical types of skills that you would imagine on any domestic abuse strengths-based intervention. And it is all obviously around, you know, self-talk, mindfulness, and looking at respectfulness, looking at what change looks like for me, etc., and managing those emotions and communications, and building a toolkit, so to speak, of other much more pro-social skills in order to address that. I know you're all going to wonder, has it been effective? Does it work? So Sarah, if we look at the next slide, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I just wanted to pick up a few points that it's early days, because we've evaluated it as the programme has developed, and the Department of Justice here have invested hugely in terms of the evaluation of the Pprp, because they want to make sure that the investment is working, and it clearly is, and we're very pleased with the progress so far, constantly building up that data set, etc. But what we know already from the early feedback is that we know that it's had a very positive impact in terms of alleged perpetrators, in terms of their behaviour, in terms of the skill set and the tools that they have now. And many of them, the majority of them, would say that it has helped them in terms of managing their behaviour, their emotions, etc., and their self-awareness. And the social workers, who obviously are the referrers, have noted significant changes in terms of those behaviours when they're on the programme, and being able to apply that learning within a family setting if indeed that's appropriate. 3/4 of partners have said that the overall programme has been effective or very helpful in terms of seeing the change in their partner behaviour. And initial long-term data supplied by the police over 1 year would show that the incidence in terms of prosecution, obviously that has reduced. So as I say, it's early days. It is not the panacea by all means, but it is another route certainly that we can offer in terms of trying to intervene as early as we possibly can. And my last couple of slides there, if we move on in terms of the evaluation, you know, over 70% of the partners that we've interviewed that have said that they have noticed these changes. These are the types of feedback that we've got. You know, they're open and more willing to discuss feelings, taking more time with their children if they have access to their children. And they have developed more coping mechanisms, better behaviour, better decision making, and understanding consequences of their choices. It is a start, and that is something that we need to continue on. In terms, Sarah, the next slide, the challenges and opportunities. From a more strategic perspective, I suppose, you know, I think there is challenges and opportunities ahead for all of us. You know, we know from our health partners, there's waiting lists for all things within the NHS, and that applies here as well. So it is about justice and health working closer together. And again, you know, are we in the right space or the wrong space? Because it kind of straddles health and justice. Quite honestly, it shouldn't matter where we're at as long as we're doing it. And it's not about doing either or, but what's certainly not about is waiting until somebody perpetrates the act to come into the justice system. And it's not about a criminal justice solution to health problems, it's about a collective approach to working to domestic abuse. It is an opportunity for justice, for us to do things different. And clearly what I've said is that it's beginning to see the improvements in criminal justice and health outcomes. For example, we know from the people that we're working with that we have a reduction in women going to A&E maybe at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. We have an increase in terms of their children going to school and being educated in a very healthy learning environment, as opposed to possibly mum not being able to get their children to school because they've spent 3 or 4 hours in A&E the night before. So these are all the kind of outcomes that we're beginning to track, that we really want to see a dent in the justice system. Lots of research opportunities, and we're doing research in this area. We want to be able to build up that long-term research. We're creating a safer Northern Ireland, I believe, and I think it adds to that problem-solving justice approach that we have here in Northern Ireland. And the kind of bigger outcomes that we're aiming to, and we're beginning to get to, Sarah, in terms of the next slide is, looking at a reduction in reoffending, that desistance from crime, not even getting into crime in the first place, increasing the capacity of men at that stage to build much more pro-social relationships and better skills to deal with the issues that bring them into the system in the first place. Improve victim awareness. We are so mindful for every perpetrator of domestic abuse there is a victim, victims, families, communities, etc. So this is our longer term outcomes in terms of how we want to see this working. And the cost effectiveness obviously are, if you look at bringing somebody into the justice system through a court stage, through PPS, through police involvement, probation involvement, prison involvement, it is avenue. As I say, it is about investing in the future. And my very last slide is that I always use this slide when I'm talking about problem solving justice and for anything at all that we attempt to do something different. I've often said that by taking a problem solving justice and an upstream approach, I suppose, certainly brings about a sense of hope for the individual that we want to change behaviour to prevent victims and families being impacted, and all of those ACEs that Sabrina spoke about earlier on. We want to provide interventions that bring hope for victims and hope for communities, because we cannot just talk about victims without talking about perpetrators. And actually, because for every victim there are perpetrators. And also, doing nothing about perpetrators and not investing in work with perpetrators, not doing that is not an option, because if we don't invest in work with perpetrators, then we create more victims. We must stop that behaviour as early as possible. And we bring hope for families, because if you listen to that very powerful video that Sabrina showed us, it was horrendous. And no matter how many times you see these things, you get that sickening, awful feeling in your stomach that there has to be something else that we could do. And lastly, my last point is that it is, and hope for our system, not just the justice system, but our system across everywhere that we work, that we can do things different to bring hope for the people that are most impacted by domestic abuse. And my last slide is just to say thank you for everybody for your time and for listening, and very happy to take questions. Thank you. Sarah, I probably ran over, so my apologies to Carmel.
Only slightly, that's fine. Just bear with me because I wasn't able to access the chat whilst I was sharing the slides. So, but thank you, Geraldine. As someone that works certainly in the post-conviction space, I always find it fascinating to hear about the preventative space. And the more I hear about it and the more I hear about the partnerships with health, to start to think how absolutely vital and critical that work is. So, where are we with questions? So we've got a question from Andrea. Would you be able to share the RRI intervention toolkit that you use in supervision, Geraldine? Is that something that's possible or not?
So I just wonder, sorry, who did you say it's from?
It's from Andrea.
Andrea, I've put my email address up at the end. If you want to email me, we can have a chat about what I can send.
And then another question we've got is is there any similar resource for female perpetrators?
So it's a question that we're always asked, and at this moment in time, we don't actually have that. The PPRP is not designed for women. However, the RRI, which is the Respectful Relationships Programme, which is the toolkit, that is what we will use for female perpetrators. So if somebody's on probation supervision, we can use the RRI, the Respectful Relationships Programme, which is that intervention that probation officers can use as part of supervision. So, and I know, Sarah, that there's great opportunities to develop domestic abuse interventions for females, because we do know that happens, and I know it's an area that we all need to, I suppose, have a look at. But for the females that come onto probation supervision, we'll use the RRI.
Okay, thank you. Andrea's just said about putting your email back up again, Geraldine. So what I'll do a bit later in the presentation, I'll put that in the chat so people have got a copy of that. But I know we've got another comment come in. So from Nicola, so in Merseyside, the help programme is available as a group work programme for females. So Sarah, if you're interested, it looks like there might be some way of getting in touch.
Let's connect. Fabulous.
Perfect. Right, I'm just aware of the time and the need to move on, but thank you very much, Geraldine, for taking your time out of your day to present to us today. And I do know that you need to head off fairly shortly, so won't be able to stick around for the rest of the presentation, but thank you again for your time. I'm sure we'll
thank you.
Okay, so moving on from that fascinating topic onto another really important topic when we're thinking about domestic abuse. But we're now going to hand over to Carmel Donnelly, who is the Assistant Principal Probation Officer for the Probation Service in Ireland. And Carmel's going to speak to us about victim considerations. So do you want me to share the slides again, Carmel? Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great, Sarah, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Okay,
it's almost good afternoon. It's still morning, I think. So hello to everybody, and it's great that you could all join us. So look I just want to talk to you today about our engagement in the probation service with domestic violence victims and some of the arising issues and some of the considerations that we should take into account when we are working with perpetrators, because as Geraldine has mentioned earlier, for every perpetrator there is a corresponding victim, so they do deserve attention, and I just wanted to have a bit of a discussion around that this morning with you. Okay, next slide. Okay, so really I just want to say that I suppose as a criminal justice agency, an agency within the criminal justice system, the probation service, most of our work obviously centres on the rehabilitation of offenders. However, we do see the rights and the needs and the protection of victims of domestic violence to be paramount in our work with domestic abusers. And we are guided as such by the Istanbul Convention and also by the 2012 Council of Europe Directive on Victims' Rights. Now, I do think it's useful to draw your attention to particular articles under this directive, which may be useful reference points, which we should really keep in mind when we're all working with perpetrators of domestic abuse. And the first one then I wanted to talk about, I suppose, is Article 3. And Article 3 of the Victims Directive is important because victims often feel lost in the criminal justice system, as you may well be aware. They don't understand it and they feel the perpetrators get preferential treatment in the justice system. So they have a right to be understood and a right to understand what is going on in the criminal justice system. Now, Article 6 also talks about the rights of victims, which is corresponding to their right to understand, but the right of victims to receive information about their case. Normally, the police, certainly in Ireland, on Garda Síochána, are the individuals who are tasked with keeping a victim abreast of the criminal justice process. But sometimes that falls down, and it is really important that that's kept centre stage, by whatever agency has access to victims. Article 7 then talks about the right to interpretation and translation, because certainly I know in Ireland, and I'm sure the same is common in Wales and England, there's been an increase in referrals of individuals into the criminal justice system whereby English is not their first language, which typically means that their victims are struggling with the English language as well. Therefore, a translation service is important for those individuals so that they can understand what is going on and have information about their case. Correspondingly, they have a right to victim support services as per Article 7 as they journey through the criminal justice system and through their interaction with the courts, with the probation service, with the police. Victims need to know and need to know what's going on, but also have to have a right to victim support services so that they are armed with the ammunition they need to make that journey themselves, because it isn't an easy journey. We know, and certainly Sabrina would have mentioned the fact that victims often have suffered about 35 instances of domestic abuse before they ever refer to the criminal justice system and make a statement to the police. So they're very brave by the time they get to this stage and have gone through a lot, and they certainly need to have support systems put in place for them. They have a right to be heard as well and have a voice in the criminal justice process, and not just to be seen as bystanders. And Article 10 draws our attention to this fact. So this is really important, that all services keep them centre stage. What's also important is that victims and perpetrators are kept separate. And we know certainly in Ireland there is great drives in the court system to have a video link for victims, or to have a separate facility for victims to give their evidence, be it virtually or otherwise, in the court system. So that need to keep them apart, because we know that there is often a risk of intimidation by perpetrators, especially in that confrontational setting of a court system. Also in Article 22, I want to draw your attention to the fact that it states that it's important that there's an individual assessment of victims to identify specific protection needs. So therefore, safety plan provisions can be made for these particular victims. So there's a lot to consider, and I suppose for all the stakeholders in the criminal justice system when we are working with perpetrators, that we don't work in isolation just with perpetrators. There are victims behind the scenes. Next slide, Sarah. Okay, so what's Ireland's response been to this EU directive, which is guiding our work so much at the moment? Well, we've produced our own legislation and transposed this EU directive into national law, and this is called the Victims of Crime Act, which was enacted in 2017. This raises the bar for us and raises the bar for what victims can expect from the criminal justice agencies as a whole, including the probation service. So leading on from that, we sought to build on this legislative framework within the probation service by establishing a specific restorative justice and victim services team in 2018. And this comprises of a central coordinator who leads, assisted by 5 senior probation officers and 14 regionally based probation officers who cover the 26 counties in the Republic of Ireland. So the main objective of this team is to become a single point of contact for victims and any queries they may have around the criminal justice system. So it's that, trying to answer their need to have information and have additional support. Next slide, Sarah. So just a little bit more about the victim services team and what services they provide and what comes their way. So I suppose it really is there to be a response to the general victim queries about the criminal justice system, because they do feel lost and invisible, and as I've said earlier, don't understand the system by and large. So therefore the probation service is on hand through this specific unit to provide information in relation specifically to probation orders, what is probation assessment, and what does probation supervision mean. Now, because of GDPR, we can't actually discuss individual cases. We can't talk about their own particular perpetrator and the progress through the system, but we can talk in general terms about what is likely to be involved in an assessment if that perpetrator has been referred to the probation service for a report, and what a likely outcome would be if we were to suggest probation supervision, and what other interventions would be provided to those perpetrators were they to come on supervision, such as perpetrator programs. So that kind of information can be shared with the victims in general. Victims also may wish to engage with the restorative justice process as well, and engage in the likes of victim offender mediation. Now, this has been rare. In fact, I don't think we've had any cases to date from domestic abuse victims for victim offender mediation. We've had a number in relation to sexual violence, and these have typically obviously been instances where there have been stranger victims and they've wished to meet their perpetrator and to have their questions answered and, you know, had to share the impact of that particular offence on them. We would have concerns, and research is really the jury's out as to whether victim offender mediation or restorative justice is effective or is safe in domestic abuse cases as well, because there is a question about how voluntary the consent of the victim may be in those instances, as they may be continuing in a relationship with the perpetrator. So therefore there will be serious safety considerations to be taken into account, and the voluntariness would have to be really assessed. But so far we haven't had any of those particular referrals or requests. Okay, next slide. So the Victim Services team has specific remit to deal with victim queries. However, in general, probation officers have the general responsibilities around the assessment of offenders, as many as you would have on this call as well as you're working in your work as probation officers. So we would look at preparing assessments on offenders referred by the court and the supervision of court-imposed orders in the community, in addition to post-release supervision orders for those who transition from the prison into the community where they're put on statutory orders. We also work in the prison settings as well, mostly preparing prisoners for release who are subject to post-release supervision orders. So that's the generic work. Now, taken within that, obviously, domestic abuse cases are referred to the probation service by the courts, and our domestic abuse cases are underpinned, and the assessments are underpinned by the ZARA version 3. We've moved on to using the version 3 of the ZARA risk assessment, the ZARA Disposal Risk Assault Assessment Instrument. In Ireland, we invite victims to contribute to the assessment process, and we see them as being a primary source of collateral information in the assessment process. So in addition to sourcing information, maybe from victim statements, but also from the local police around what the victim may have experienced, we will invite the victim to participate in the ZARA assessment, and part of it at least anyway. Now for this, obviously, the victim consent is important, and they can choose not to engage in this process, and we will go to the police to seek that consent from the victims. So it's not mandatory, and we wish to be empowering and not coerce, subject victims to further coercion. They've already been through enough of that in the course of the domestic abuse that they've suffered. So it is purely a voluntary process, obviously. Victim safety, of course, now is a primary consideration for the probation staff who are doing these assessments, and a huge concern, because there is potential, obviously, for service-generated risks when we meet victims as well, and we don't want to put them at further risk of harm by our engagement with them. So we try to do that very carefully. For that reason, then, victims will be interviewed separately to perpetrators, obviously in a venue of their choosing, as per Article 19 of the Victims Directive. So we need to be very careful around that, because we know perpetrators are very clever and often want to accompany the victims to probation interviews as well during the course of their own assessment, and may be quite threatened by the fact that a victim may be part of that process. So we give him limited information about our role with victims, more that we're there to offer support to the victims and to offer them information on specialist services that they can avail of. So the next slide there, Sarah, then. So here I just want to talk to you a little bit about the role of the probation officer with victims, and you may just wonder, why do you have a role with victims at all? Well, primarily because we see them as a major source of information, and we do not like to depend on perpetrator self-report, because we know that perpetrators of domestic abuse are prone to denial and minimisation in terms of their behaviours. And certainly we know there's really fruitful information that is derived from speaking directly to victims. So what we like to understand, we use this information, I suppose, to understand the nature and the extent of domestic abuse and violence which will be suffered by victims, and this will enhance the ZARA assessment. We also want to ascertain the victim's perception of risk of future victimization, because we know that they're victims, or they're experts in this regards, and we must listen to them and allow them the right to self-determination. This is really important for them because they've been disempowered for so long. The perpetrator risk assessment plan then, post-assessment, will include victim safety considerations, and this might include things such as the court ruling, are we suggesting that the perpetrator not reside within a certain distance of the victim, and we would flag risks for particular index victims as well, particular to that case. Okay, the next slide. So though there are some limitations, obviously, in relation to the victim probation service, the victim involvement. Probation officers primarily are involved with victims around the assessment process. So it may be 1 or 2 interviews at the most with the victim, perhaps with the support of particular victim support or specialist services. We do not adopt, and certainly do not recommend adopting an ongoing caseworker role with the victims, because obviously that would be a conflict of interest for us going forward in our work with the perpetrator. So it is really to enhance our knowledge around the reality of that domestic abuse context and situation that we're working with. We therefore we refer or direct the victims to specialist victim support services such as Women's Aid or Safe Ireland, who provide a lot of local services in the 26 counties. So we direct those and handhold victims into those services so that they will get ongoing support as we work with the men. Okay. We also would encourage victims to maintain contact with the police if they've any ongoing safety concerns, because, you know, there may be, especially if they're continuing in a relationship or they've just recently broken up. We know the stalking, harassment and continued domestic abuse, if they're in a relationship or recently separated, is a risk. So we would encourage them to maintain contact with the police if they've ongoing safety concerns. The police then would provide information on the progress of the court case, because, you know, sometimes we have victims who would come back to us because they've made, you know, contact with a probation officer whom they develop a reasonable relationship with, and we'll come back sometimes looking for information on the progress of the case. But because we're not going to continue case holding the victim, we will direct them back to the police for the progression and case history and information on what's going to happen with that case going forward, because it can take some time to go through the court system. So that's the route we would direct them. Next slide there, Sarah. So while somebody's on a perpetrator treatment programme, be it through an NGO co-opted by the probation service or within the probation service itself, our victim contact really centres on the risks, the likelihood of risks as the individual is. We're working with perpetrators on that perpetrator programme. So we like to see if there's any updated information around risks from victims. So we would co-opt the specialist victim services to liaise with us to keep us updated in relation to particular risks to victims on an ongoing basis as we work with the man. Furthermore, selective information is provided to victims via the specialist victim services about aspects of the programme work that may impinge on the woman, such as timeout techniques, which may be rather confusing to the woman, but so she needs to have the likes of that explained to her so she knows what to expect, and to also be aware when that could be abused by a perpetrator as well. So certain key aspects of the programme or where the individual is at on modules of the programme will be shared through these specialist services with the victim, but obviously not specific details about how the man is getting on per se, but just where he's at and what to expect as the individual goes through the actual programme. Next slide, Sarah. Okay, so that's how we work with victims, and that's how we have contact with victims as we work with perpetrators. But what are some of the challenges that we're experiencing as we go about this work? Well, there's one issue, I suppose, is how to store victim information safely, because obviously we have GDPR considerations to take into account. So what do you do with the information that you may have taken note of when you have met with the victim? Clearly, we have to make provisions for GDPR. It could be subject to FOI release, this file, by the perpetrator, and due care must be taken of that victim information. So we would highlight in bold that this is sensitive information which is not to be shared in the event of an FOI request. So that has to be clearly stated in the case notes that we, around the information received from the victims to handle that with care. Maintaining the victim safety obviously is a real concern for the staff as well on a day-to-day basis, and practicalities about like where to meet victims, whether you contact them by phone, whether we should write to them. We don't write to them any longer. In fact, inviting them to participate in the assessment process, we go through the Gardaí or the police and we ask them for contact phone numbers, because we know there's a risk that letters can be intercepted by perpetrators. So we constantly are revising what is safe practice in terms of our contact with victims. We know as well that it's crucial that information which is provided by victims is not directly quoted in reports to court, unless the victim specifically wants that. Sometimes they do, but it's really that information is back of the head stuff, I suppose, for the probation officer in terms of understanding the offended behaviour and the risk of future victimisation. So it's getting a more holistic understanding and picture of the context of this particular domestic abuse case, and all of the information which the victim has to share or can share is obviously, it adds to the richness of that as well. So clearly the information which is disclosed by victims shouldn't be shared with the offender, because we know this could put them at further risk as well. So there has to be due care that we don't reference specific quotes by victims in reports, and that we don't disclose verbally to the perpetrator what is shared by the victim. So it's very minimal information he would be given. It's more around the need to support the victim and direct her to specialist services as such as what we would be sharing with the perpetrator. Now, one of the challenges we face is the victims, I suppose, can find it hard to let go of the probation officer once a rapport is established. Even though it may be only 1 or 2 interviews, it can be quite in-depth interviews, and it may be sharing in detail for maybe the first time, and that can be quite challenging and quite difficult and emotional for a victim. And they may obviously develop a rapport with the particular probation officer and find a struggle to actually reduce that rapport and to let go. So that for that reason, we do try and handhold them with care into the specialist services, so that they're not just dropped coldly, but that they're supported and introduced to the victim services in as supportive a manner as possible, so that there's somebody there for them when we leave the scene, if you like. Another challenge, I suppose, can be the fact that, and you may have come across this yourselves as probation officers, that conflicting information can be provided by a victim and an offender where there is mutual inter-partner violence. So this can be a challenge. This isn't the case in all cases, but certainly can arise and can be, a challenge for a probation officer in terms of what's fact or fiction here in dealing with these particular cases. So it's a skill in terms of drilling under it to see who is the primary perpetrator in this particular case. Next slide. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, so what then, when we're faced with all these challenges, is best practice, and how can we work more effectively in the work of working with perpetrators, but keeping victims safe as we do so, and keeping victim considerations into the forefront? As Sabrina would have mentioned earlier, and obviously Geraldine as well made reference to it, the integrated approach is the best approach. Victim safety will be better achieved through interagency cooperation and working. Now, we know it can be a challenge to get all the stakeholders around the table. That is what we must do, because working in silos is not the answer. This is where, service generated risks can come to the fore. And we know by sitting around the table, be it with the police, with the health services, with the women's organisations and the probation services, we are better fit to do a holistic job and a safe job in working with perpetrators. Obviously, as well, we need to understand each other's unique contribution, because it can be a challenge to develop trust and understanding amongst all the players in the justice system and to the NGOs as well. So that's important, that we work hard to actually understand what we all have to contribute, and each contribution is unique. It's not that we're trying to become Gardaí or the police want to become probation officers, but we work together to understand each other's role and how we can complement each other better. We also know that understanding, all players having a really deep understanding of the dynamics of intimate partner abuse and being trauma informed in their practice also assist us to produce best practice as well. So there's some of the suggestions I'd have going forward, and I'd like to take any questions anybody might have. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so I'm just having a look. It doesn't look like we've got any at the moment, Carmel, but thank you very much for giving us that insight into how the probation services work with victims within Ireland. I can definitely see some semblance with how our probation services in England and Wales work with our victims. So thank you very much for that. If people do think of questions over the next few minutes, feel free to add them into the chat. But last but not least, then we'll move on to our final presentation of the day, which is from Vaclav. So Vaclav is the head psychologist for the prison service in the Czech Republic, and he's going to be speaking to us today about programs and the learning taken from programs. So I will hand over to you, Vaclav. Oh, I think you might be on mute. That's
micro. Thank you very much, Sarah. Because you don't have my presentation, I have to share it by myself, so I will just try it right now. Whether it works.
It was coming up a moment ago.
Okay, now you can possibly see it. Is that so?
I can see your main slide and the slide that's due to come up afterwards.
Okay, so that's not what I wanted to show you. Maybe. No. Sorry.
Sabrina, you changed your
because I'm sharing not. Okay, now I can. Can you see the?
No, now we can see mixture of screens.
All right.
Sabrina, did you know you did it earlier, didn't you?
Yes, and
yes,
I will share that one.
That's it. That's perfect.
Yes.
Is it that? Yes.
Yes.
Great. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I may greet all the 24 or 25 brave participants who stayed with us until now. I'm going to say a few words about the programs for violent offenders. And now you may ask why I'm talking about programs for violent offenders and not offenders of domestic violence. We don't have programs for domestic violent offenders only, and that has two reasons mainly. The first one is that our research and our experience as well says that 7 out of 10 violent offenders we have in our treatment programs committed a violent act in close relations, which means that they behaved violently towards their partners, wives, children, and so on. But usually they don't really conscious about it until they start to participate in one of the treatment programs. And 9 of 10 those violent offenders experienced domestic violence in their childhood. And the other reason is that, well, of course, there is in our law there are paragraphs about domestic violence, so that you can go into the prison for domestic violence, and the number of expulsions from home is not very low. But in most cases, the people who committed domestic violent crime, they aren't accused and sentenced for domestic violence, but for another type of crime. Now, I would like to share the context with you, because the context is important, of course. It may help you understand our decisions in my country and our roadmap, and also it can help you to compare what you will see with your experience in your countries or at your workplace, in your agencies. I'm sitting right now, in the sunny city of Prague. We have 26 degrees Celsius, and as you know, in Central Europe, a country with 10 million inhabitants, and we have 35 prisons with almost 20,000 inmates. Speaking of psychologists, because I'm in charge of psychological and therapeutical services, we have 150 psychologists and 55 psychotherapists, which are not externals. They are our employees, like the employees of the prison service. Plus, there are other experts from other agencies coming into the prisons. Regarding the violent offenders, when you are a violent offender and you are released, then it's highly probable, with 40% of probability, that after 6 months after your release, you will be back in the prison. And after 1 year after your release, you will be back, or 50% of violent offenders are back in the prison again. So these numbers are pretty high, I am afraid. And that's why we are doing something with that. Of course, not everything is from our labs, our laboratories. We learned a lot from other countries, as your countries maybe too. We learned a lot of Canada, from UK, from the UK, from Germany and from Norway in the recent years. But let's start with the UK, because we realized that we can't start proper interventions without knowing the inmates perfectly. And that's why we started to develop a risk assessment tool. Originally, we wanted to adopt the OASIS risk assessment tool, but somehow we realized that we need something which reflects our needs, and that's why we were inspired by a couple of risk assessment tools, but then we developed our own one, and that was the moment when we really started to focus on external risks, on criminogenic risks, and we separated them from like the internal risks within the prison, because of course the public and the victims, the potential victims, they don't really care about what's going on in prisons, but they want to feel safe outside of, after the release. So the instrument is pretty comprehensive, and the basic idea is that every prisoner is interviewed by a number of staff members. There is always a tutor, a psychologist, a social worker, and a special tutor, and they collect all the information together, so that at the end we have some, I can skip that, we have some numbers and some charts and some texts as well. That's very important, because we have the detailed information, not only how risky, how high the level of risk of the offender is, and what's the content of the risk, but it gives us also a level for, or basement for further recommendations for particular interventions. And that's something which we needed in a standardized way, and which we didn't have before this instrument. Let's say this is This is an instrument we have been using for 10 years, and we find it very useful. Now, if you ask me, okay, let's go to the interventions and what's the main therapeutical approach. You may probably think of cognitive behavioral therapy because it's something which is everywhere in the literature, and the books about cognitive behavioral therapy are the most thick books. But actually it's not necessary, and we use a mixture of different approaches. I may call it an eclectic style. We use a lot of techniques from psychodynamic psychotherapy, from scheme therapy, but at the end, the most important thing is that we base our psychotherapies on the risk and needs and responsibility principle from Andrews and Bonta, and we are very much using the crime-oriented therapy principles from Frank Urbaniak from Switzerland. And of course, you know these principles because they are standard in almost in most countries. And that gives us the opportunity to make different groups from the prisoners, so that we can serve them with different approach and different interventions. Now you can see the map of the Czech Republic with all the 35 prisons, and within the prisons you can see different colors. The colors mean different intervention programs. Some of them are like therapeutical programs, but the main two groups are the special treatment units, usually for people with some kind of mental disorder or personality disorder, and then the standardized programs, which usually consist of a series of sessions, let's say 10 or 30 or 40 sessions, and then it's the end of the program and another group can start. So the difference between the standardized programs and special treatment units is that the special treatment units are like semi-open therapy groups with therapeutic communities, and usually the program lasts for 1 year, but it's more about like medical treatment and psychology, but standardized programs can be led by not only by psychologists or psychotherapists, but by trained, well-educated staff as well. Let's have a look on the special treatment units. We call them special treatment units, but they are special in some way because the participants get 21 treatment hours per week, containing everyday morning community session and group psychotherapy, and then different other various other kinds of activities. The challenging part is the timing of this therapy, because you know, if you have a man or a woman serving his or her 10 years sentence, then the timing is very important. Shall it be at the very beginning, or shall it be just before the possible conditional release? So that is quite important. Usually we start it as soon as possible, but not later than before the possible conditional release can occur. We did a study with about 200 inmates, and we compared, I can't see whether you see my mouse now, we compared the reference groups from like normal sentence without therapy, with the normal sentence plan, with the standard procedures, but no therapy, with males with therapy, and we focused on the effect size. And as you can see, the effect size, if you compare the recidivism rate in violent offenders within 12 months after release, then you can see that there is a huge difference. Similar differences, by the way, after 2 years after release, and of course there is a huge difference in the general recidivism rate as well. Now, if you are, some of you are maybe psychologists, you may be interested in some changes on the personality level or behavior level. It's quite interesting that if we, or when we collected data at some point, and then after 1 year, which was the joining point, or the joining to the program, then nothing changed really. It was like the people were quite, they were impulsive in the very same way, sensation seeking was on the same level, and so on. But after the program, you can see the effect on that. In that case, sensation seeking went down, relationality went down, the ability of anticipation went up, the impulsivity went down, and so on. Then the other part, and I have to look at my watch, I have maybe 3 minutes left. The other part are the standardized programs. These are the programs which were have been standardized already. You can see that we have different programs for people involved in violence against children, including domestic violence or violence against children at their homes, or towards children they knew very well, and so on. Some of the programs are provided in cooperation with other agencies. In the Czech Republic, the probation service is not part of the prison service, like in Norway, for example. These are two separated agencies, and still we cooperate in a very, very good way. And that's one of the examples that our lecturers and trainers come both from prison service and probation service, and they work together in the therapeutical settings as well. Another example of cooperation between the prison service and an NGO, non-governmental organization, is called Building Bridges. Maybe you know it from your country. I'm not sure, because this is a very international thing. And that's the series of group sessions where real offenders meet real victims, but not their victims, not the victims of their crimes, but victims who volunteered, offered themselves as volunteers to participate in this program. And of course, this is also focused on self-reflection and empathy, and so on. Another example, on Saturday I just came up from Norway, because we started a cooperation and implementation, the Norwegian program Motivator, into our prisons, which is meant for perpetrators of violent crimes as well. And then we also work with groups of violent offenders within some special settings. For example, in our open prison, for people who were able to lower their criminogenic risk, and but they still need some treatment, so we provide them here. Now I will finish with the very new model or approach which we started in 6 prisons, and now you can see the 6 prisons as well. And this is maybe the very first pilot where we have real control groups, and this is actually a double control setting or design, which we are very proud of. Those of you who work in prisons, they might know how difficult it is to build such a controlled setting with control groups. Now we have here 6 prisons. In each prison there are 4 groups of prisoners. One group is provided with the Good Lives model, which is a special therapeutic approach, which you might know from your countries. And then a half of that group takes or is provided with another intervention, which is called accompaniment by volunteers from outside, which are attending the prisons. And then there is some cultural program for everyone, which includes concerts or theater visits and so on. And then we used some risk assessment tools like the Czech one, SARPO, but also HCR20 and PCLR, which you might be familiar with, and also MMPI2, which is a psychodiagnostic tool, like a clinical tool describing the personality. And we found out, of course, we compared the control groups and with the intervention groups, and we can say that and we matched them together, so that we can say that in all groups the average participant is a male, 34 years old. He serves his 3rd time on average in prison. He usually left education after 1 year of high school, has 1 child, and has high risk on both dynamic and static risk factors, and has some problems with finances and personality and behavior, and addictions very often as well. And typical client in that controlled design was someone who suffered of losing self-control in anger, with frequent presence of neurological symptoms, and with very much present antisocial behavior. Now, compared to the general prison population, the participants of the Good Lives model are slightly higher risk, with significantly less of the extremes found in the general prison population, both on the very mild side as well as on the very extreme side. Now, what are the results? The main results, and I'm also concluding my presentation, are that this program, similar to other programs, leads to a significant reduction in the risk of violent and antisocial behavior, while at the same time, that's quite interesting, we see some weakening of masculinist or men patterns of behavior. And we also discovered that those inmates who work who are employed, who have employment, and they also at the same time visit the therapy, they are most likely or more likely to complete the therapy successfully. I got permission to show this last picture, but also you can find my email address here. So if you have any questions which would extend the time today, you can write me an email and I will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Vaclav. If you just want to stop sharing your slides.
Yes, I will try.
Okay.
And
in the meantime, just to say we've not had any further questions come into the chat, but obviously if people have got them, take Vaclav up on that offer to give him an email. I'm aware we are literally bang on the 12 o'clock mark and obviously don't want to make you late for other activities that are going on through your day. I just want to extend a really huge thank you to all of our speakers today, and I really hope that the people that have attended have found learning about some of the practices in other countries as interesting as I certainly have whilst I've been involved in the expert group. So thank you all very much. We will share the slides, and there will be the recording will go onto the intranet at some point. And thank you for attending.